The night in Walford did not arrive gently. It crept in like a warning, stretching shadows across Albert Square as if the ground itself already knew something had gone terribly wrong. There was a stillness in the air that felt unnatural, the kind that settles just before everything begins to fall apart, and somewhere within that silence, Mark was already running out of time. Earlier that evening, the weight of debt had pressed against him like an invisible force, tightening around his chest with every passing hour. The £200,000 he owed to Russell was no longer just a number. It had become a countdown, a ticking threat that echoed in every decision he made, every risk he took. Even when he tried to convince himself that he still had options, that he could fix things, there was always that underlying truth gnawing at him: he was already too deep. Meanwhile, across Walford, the shadow of the Mitchell family loomed large, even when they were unaware of the storm gathering at their doorstep. Phil Mitchell carried his usual aura of control, the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be felt. He had spent years holding his family together through violence, betrayal, and loss, but this time, the danger was approaching from a place he couldn't yet see. At the same time, Grant Mitchell had already made his sacrifice, selling his bar in Portugal in a desperate attempt to pull Mark out of the hole he had dug for himself. It was not just a financial decision. It was a statement of loyalty, a reminder that no matter how far someone in the Mitchell family fell, they were never meant to fall alone. And yet, Mark had refused to accept that lifeline fully, driven by a stubborn pride that now threatened to cost him everything. Not long after, Mark found himself moving through the square with a restlessness that betrayed his fear. Every glance over his shoulder lingered a second too long, every sound seemed sharper, more intrusive. He told himself he was just being cautious, but deep down, he knew the truth: Russell was no longer waiting patiently. Desperation pushed him into reckless choices. Alongside Lauren, he had crossed a line that could not easily be undone, selling a stolen car through the lot in a rushed attempt to gather cash. The act itself was quick, almost mechanical, but the consequences rippled outward immediately. It didn't take long for Max Branning and Jack Branning to notice that something wasn't right. Their suspicion wasn't loud or confrontational. It was quieter than that, more dangerous, the kind that builds slowly until it becomes undeniable. Even so, Mark kept moving, clinging to the illusion that he still had time, that he could somehow bridge the gap before Russell decided to act. But Russell was not a man who tolerated delays, and patience had never been part of his nature. As all this was happening, the rest of Walford was preparing for something entirely different: a farewell. The day of Nigel's funeral was approaching, and with it came a wave of grief that touched even those who had long since learned how to hide their emotions. The square had seen countless goodbyes over the years, but each one carved its own unique scar, and this one would be no different. Yet beneath that shared mourning, another story was quietly unfolding, one that would soon collide with the funeral in a way no one could have anticipated. Later that night, Mark found himself alone, the streets around him emptier than usual, as if the world had subtly withdrawn. The glow of street lights cast long, distorted shadows across the pavement, and for a brief moment, everything seemed suspended in time. It was in that fragile stillness that the van appeared. It did not arrive with noise or warning. It simply pulled up beside him, its presence immediate and suffocating. There was no time to react, no opportunity to run. The door slid open, and before Mark could fully process what was happening, hands were on him, firm, unyielding, dragging him into the darkness inside. The world outside vanished in an instant. The struggle was brief, chaotic, and ultimately futile. Mark's voice, if he tried to use it, was swallowed by the enclosed space, by the speed at which everything unfolded. Within seconds, he was no longer part of Walford, no longer visible to anyone who might have helped him. The van pulled away, merging back into the night as if nothing had happened. Back in the square, life continued, unaware, uninterrupted. Doors closed, lights flickered off, conversations faded into silence. But somewhere, just beyond that fragile sense of normality, a line had been crossed. From that moment on, everything would change. The next morning did not bring clarity, it brought confusion. News of Mark's disappearance did not spread all at once. It seeped into the square gradually, carried by small moments that didn't quite add up. The first crack came when Vicky Fowler arrived, her concern immediate, her questions simple but loaded with unease. She had expected to find Mark with the family, assumed he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But when Phil Mitchell and Grant Mitchell exchanged uncertain glances, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a hesitation, a flicker of realization that neither of them wanted to fully acknowledge. Then the truth began to settle. Mark wasn't with Vicky. And if he wasn't with her, then there was only one explanation that made sense. The name Russell didn't need to be spoken aloud. It hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable, a silent confirmation of what they were all beginning to understand. The debt, the pressure, the threats, it had all been building toward this. Phil's expression hardened almost instantly, the calm surface giving way to something far more dangerous. This was no longer a situation to manage or negotiate. This was personal. Grant felt it too, though it manifested differently, a surge of anger mixed with guilt, the realization that everything he had done to help might not have been enough. They had tried to buy Mark time, tried to shield him from the worst of it. But time had run out. Meanwhile, preparations for Nigel's funeral continued, the contrast between grief and urgency becoming almost unbearable. The family had planned to attend, to stand together in respect and remembrance. But now, the priorities were shifting, pulled in a completely different direction by the growing certainty that Mark's life was in immediate danger. Even so, there was a moment, a brief, fragile attempt to hold on to normality, when they considered going to the funeral first, delaying action just long enough to honor Nigel properly. It was a thought rooted in loyalty, in the belief that some things should not be overshadowed. But that illusion didn't last. Because deep down, they all knew the truth. If they waited, even for a moment, they might not find Mark alive. And just like that, the decision was made, not through words, but through instinct, through the unspoken understanding that family came first, even in the face of death, even in the shadow of another farewell waiting to happen. The race had begun. And somewhere far from Walford, Mark was already paying the price. The urgency did not erupt all at once. It spread through the Mitchell family like a tightening grip, each passing second adding weight to the realization that they were already behind. The square, which only hours earlier had been preparing for a farewell, now stood on the edge of something far more volatile, where grief and danger began to intertwine in ways no one could control. Inside the Mitchell circle, there was no room left for doubt. Phil Mitchell moved first, not with panic, but with that cold, calculated focus that had defined him for years. He did not waste time asking questions he already knew the answers to. Russell had taken Mark. That was the only truth that mattered now, and everything else became secondary. Beside him, Grant Mitchell carried a different kind of tension, one that simmered just beneath the surface. His earlier decision to sell his bar, to sacrifice a part of his own life to save Mark, now felt painfully incomplete. It was not enough. It had never been enough. And the realization burned through him with a sharpness that left no space for hesitation. At the same time, the presence of Sam Mitchell added another layer of unease to the situation. She did not speak immediately, but her expression betrayed something deeper than concern. There was recognition there, an unspoken connection to Russell that she could not ignore. The past, which the Mitchells often tried to bury, had a way of resurfacing at the worst possible moment, and this time it threatened to complicate everything. Meanwhile, Walford itself seemed to stand in quiet contrast to the storm building within the family. Preparations for Nigel's funeral continued, almost mechanically, as if the community were clinging to routine to avoid acknowledging the disruption unfolding in parallel. People moved through the motions of mourning, unaware that another crisis was already pulling the Mitchells away from the very event meant to bring them together. Back with the family, the shift from uncertainty to action happened quickly. There was no formal decision, no lengthy discussion. It was instinctive. Mark needed to be found, and he needed to be found now. The funeral, important as it was, became something distant, something that could not take precedence over a life hanging in the balance. Not long after, they began to trace Russell's movements, piecing together fragments of information with the kind of urgency that left no room for mistakes. Every contact, every memory, every past encounter with Russell became relevant. The Mitchells had dealt with men like him before, men who thrived on fear, who used time as a weapon. They understood the rules of this game, even if the stakes felt higher than ever. As all this was happening, Mark's world had narrowed to something far more brutal and immediate. The darkness inside the van had been only the beginning. Wherever Russell's men had taken him, it was not a place meant for negotiation, it was a place designed to break him. The air was heavy, the space confined, and the silence between moments stretched painfully long. Mark's thoughts, once scattered and desperate, began to sharpen under pressure. He knew why he was there. He knew what Russell wanted. The money had never just been about repayment, it had been about control, about sending a message. And now, Mark himself had become that message. Even so, there was a part of him that refused to give him completely. He clung to the belief that his family would come for him, that they would not let this end here. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep him from collapsing under the weight of what he was facing. Back in Walford, the Mitchells closed in on their target. The tension among them grew thicker with every step, every new piece of information leading them closer to a confrontation that none of them could avoid. Phil Mitchell remained at the center of it all, his presence steady, almost immovable. He had faced countless enemies over the years, but this was different. This was not just about power or reputation, it was about family. Grant, meanwhile, carried the anger that Phil kept tightly controlled. His movements were sharper, more restless, as if he were already anticipating the moment when words would no longer be enough. The idea of Russell laying hands on Mark was something he could not accept, and the longer it took to reach him, the more that anger threatened to boil over. And then there was Sam. She remained slightly apart, watching, calculating, her mind clearly working through something the others did not yet fully understand. The mention of Russell had triggered something in her memory, something unresolved. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that immediately shifted the atmosphere. There was history there. Not the kind that could be dismissed or ignored, but the kind that lingered, shaping the present in ways that were impossible to predict. Whatever connection she had to Russell, it was not simple, and it was not harmless. It added a layer of unpredictability to an already volatile situation, forcing the Mitchells to confront not just an external threat, but the ghosts within their own past. Even so, they pressed on. Because time was no longer something they could afford to waste. As they drew closer to Russell's location, the tension became almost unbearable, each step forward carrying the possibility of what they might find, and what they might lose. The closer they got, the more the reality of the situation settled in. This would not be a negotiation. This would not end cleanly. This would be a confrontation. And somewhere in the distance, the echoes of Nigel's funeral bells began to ring, a haunting reminder of the other loss unfolding at the same time. The sound carried across Walford, weaving through the streets, touching every corner of the square. For the Mitchells, it was a cruel contrast. One goodbye already in motion. Another hanging in the balance. And between them, a race against time that was about to reach its breaking point. The closer they moved toward Russell, the heavier the air became, as though the world itself resisted what was about to unfold. There was no longer any illusion left, no fragile hope that this situation might resolve quietly. Every step taken by the Mitchells carried with it the weight of confrontation, the certainty that whatever waited ahead would leave a mark that could not be undone. At the front, Phil Mitchell walked with a controlled intensity that bordered on something more dangerous. He was not a man driven by panic, and yet beneath that steady exterior there was a storm gathering, one that had been building ever since Mark's disappearance became real. This was not just about retrieving someone who had made mistakes. This was about sending a message back, to Russell, to anyone who thought they could touch his family and walk away. Beside him, Grant Mitchell felt the pressure in a different way. Where Phil's anger was contained, Grant's was raw, closer to the surface, threatening to spill out at any moment. He had already sacrificed more than most would have been willing to give, and yet here they were, still chasing the consequences of a situation that refused to be fixed. The idea that Mark might already be beyond saving was something he refused to accept, but it lingered at the edges of his thoughts, unspoken and suffocating. Behind them, Sam Mitchell moved in silence, her mind locked in a battle of its own. The name Russell had not left her since it was first spoken, and the closer they got, the more that past connection began to take shape. It wasn't just familiarity, it was something deeper, something unresolved, something that now threatened to surface at the worst possible moment. Meanwhile, far from the Mitchells, the place where Mark was being held seemed detached from time itself. The space was dim, confined, and oppressive, the kind of environment designed not just to contain a person, but to strip him down mentally. Mark had lost track of how long he had been there. Minutes stretched into something unmeasurable, each second dragging on with a quiet brutality that made it impossible to think clearly. And yet, despite everything, his mind refused to shut down completely. He replayed every decision that had led him here, the debt, the deals, the moment he believed he could outmaneuver someone like Russell. It all seemed so distant now, like choices made by someone else. The only thing that mattered was survival, and even that felt uncertain. There were moments when the silence broke, footsteps, muffled voices, the sense of movement beyond the walls. Each sound pulled him back to reality, reminding him that he was no longer in control of anything. He was waiting now, waiting for something to happen, without knowing what that something would be. Back on the move, the Mitchells finally reached the point where everything converged. Russell's location was no longer just a possibility, it was real, tangible, close enough that the tension shifted into something sharper, more immediate. The kind of tension that precedes impact. Phil slowed, not out of hesitation, but out of precision. This was the moment where mistakes could not be afforded. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and everything could spiral beyond recovery. His eyes scanned the surroundings, taking in every detail, every potential threat, every possible outcome. Grant, however, was already on edge, his patience worn thin by the hours of uncertainty. He did not want to wait, did not want to think through strategies or contingencies. He wanted action. He wanted Mark back, and more than that, he wanted Russell to understand exactly what it meant to cross the Mitchell family. Sam stepped forward then, breaking the silence in a way that shifted the entire dynamic. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried a familiarity that did not belong in that moment. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger, it was recognition, and that recognition changed everything. Because Russell knew her too. The past, which had lingered in the background until now, suddenly became part of the present. Whatever history existed between Sam and Russell was not something that could be ignored or pushed aside. It hung in the air between them, altering the balance of power in a way no one had fully anticipated. And just like that, the confrontation began. Russell did not appear as a man caught off guard. He stood with the confidence of someone who believed he still held the upper hand, even with the Mitchells standing in front of him. For him, this was not a situation to escape, it was a situation to control. The moment his eyes landed on Sam, something shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Recognition, calculation, a connection that ran deeper than the others could immediately understand. And in that moment, the tension evolved into something far more complicated than a simple rescue mission. Phil stepped forward, his presence alone enough to fill the space with an unspoken threat. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to explain why he was there. Everything about him made it clear. This was the end of whatever game Russell thought he was playing. Grant moved slightly to the side, positioning himself instinctively, ready for whatever might happen next. There was no trust here, no expectation that words alone would resolve anything. The possibility of violence was not just present, it was inevitable. Sam, caught between past and present, became the unexpected center of the moment. Russell's attention lingered on her longer than it should have, as though he were weighing something, considering possibilities that extended beyond the situation at hand. Whatever their history had been, it had not ended cleanly. And now, that unresolved past was threatening to interfere with everything the Mitchells were trying to do. For a brief moment, time seemed to stretch again. No one moved. No one spoke. The air between them tightened, pulling every emotion, fear, anger, regret, loyalty, into a single, unbearable pause. And then, everything shifted at once. Because this was no longer just about Mark. This was about power. About history. About who would walk away, and who would be left behind. And somewhere, beneath all of that, was a single, urgent question that none of them could ignore any longer. Was Mark still alive? The silence that followed the initial confrontation did not last, but when it broke, it did so in a way that felt inevitable rather than sudden, as though every second leading up to that moment had been guiding them toward a single, unavoidable outcome. The tension that had been building between the Mitchells and Russell no longer remained suspended. It began to move, to shift, to press forward with a force that neither side could hold back any longer. At the center of it all, Phil Mitchell maintained a presence that was both controlled and deeply threatening, his gaze fixed on Russell with the kind of focus that suggested he had already calculated how far this situation might go. He did not rush, nor did he hesitate, but instead allowed the weight of his silence to do most of the work, making it clear that this was not a negotiation between equals but a reckoning that had been delayed for far too long. Russell, however, did not retreat under that pressure. His composure remained intact, but there was a shift in the way he carried himself, particularly when his attention returned to Sam Mitchell, whose presence complicated matters in ways that were not immediately visible to the others. The past between them lingered in the air, shaping the tone of the confrontation without needing to be fully explained, and it was precisely that unspoken history that prevented the situation from collapsing into immediate violence. Meanwhile, Grant Mitchell stood ready to act, his restraint visibly fraying as the seconds passed without resolution. The frustration he carried was no longer just about Mark's disappearance, it was about the sense that they were being forced into a slower, more controlled exchange when every instinct told him that time was already running out. His movements became sharper, his attention fixed not only on Russell but also on the men positioned around him, each one representing a potential escalation that could turn the situation beyond recovery. As the confrontation deepened, it became clear that Russell had no intention of surrendering control easily. The way he held himself, the measured confidence in his posture, suggested that he believed he still possessed leverage, and that leverage was Mark. Even without seeing him, even without hearing him, Mark's presence, or absence, dominated every decision being made in that space. The uncertainty surrounding his condition added an unbearable weight to the moment, forcing the Mitchells to balance urgency with caution in a way that went against their natural instincts. The turning point did not come from aggression, but from recognition. Russell's attention lingered on Sam once again, and in that prolonged glance there was an acknowledgement that shifted the balance of power. Whatever history they shared was not trivial, and it introduced an element of unpredictability that neither Phil nor Grant could fully control. Sam, for her part, did not step back from that recognition. Instead, she held her ground, her expression revealing a mixture of defiance and something far more complicated, something rooted in a past that refused to remain buried. This moment of tension forced the Mitchells into a position they rarely occupied, one where brute force alone could not guarantee the outcome they needed. Phil understood it immediately. His approach adjusted, not in weakness, but in calculation, as he recognized that the situation required precision rather than dominance. Every word, every movement, had to serve a purpose, because one misstep could push Russell into making a decision that would cost Mark his life. At the same time, the absence of Mark began to feel more pronounced, more oppressive, as though his unseen presence was pressing against all of them from the edges of the confrontation. The longer the standoff continued, the more that absence transformed into a threat, a reminder that whatever was happening here was only part of a larger, more dangerous reality unfolding elsewhere. Eventually, the fragile balance broke, not through an explosion of violence, but through a shift in control that forced the situation forward. The Mitchells were no longer reacting, they were pressing, closing in, forcing Russell to respond rather than dictate. It was not a clean transition, nor was it without risk, but it marked the moment when the confrontation began to move toward resolution. Russell's composure cracked, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that he was no longer entirely in control of the situation. His attention flickered between Phil, Grant, and Sam, as though reassessing the dynamics he had previously relied on. The realization that the Mitchells would not back down, that they were willing to push this to its limit, began to alter his calculations in real time. From that moment on, the confrontation became a test of endurance as much as anything else. Each side waited for the other to make a decisive move, to reveal their hand, to commit to an action that could not be undone. The space between them felt smaller, more volatile, as though it could ignite at any second, and yet it remained suspended, held in place by the shared understanding of what was at stake. Not long after, the situation reached a point where retreat was no longer an option for either side. The Mitchells had come too far to turn back, and Russell had invested too much to walk away without consequence. The question was no longer whether something would happen, but how far it would go, and who would bear the cost when it did. In the distance, the faint echo of the funeral bells could still be heard, a haunting reminder of the life being mourned back in Walford. That sound carried into the confrontation like an accusation, underscoring the cruel overlap of loss and violence that defined that day. While one farewell was unfolding in quiet sorrow, another potential loss hung precariously in the balance, waiting for its outcome to be decided in this tense, fragile moment. As the final phase of the standoff approached, the Mitchells braced themselves for what came next, knowing that whatever happened would not end cleanly. The outcome, whether it brought relief or devastation, would ripple outward, affecting not just them, but the entire square. And somewhere beyond the immediate confrontation, Mark's fate remained uncertain, suspended between survival and tragedy, dependent on decisions being made in real time by people who understood that there would be no second chance to get it right. The final moments of the confrontation did not arrive with a single decisive action, but rather unfolded through a gradual collapse of tension, as though the entire situation had been stretched to its absolute limit and could no longer sustain itself. Every movement, every glance, carried the weight of consequence, and in that fragile space between control and chaos, the outcome began to take shape. At the center of it all, Phil Mitchell remained unshaken, his presence anchoring the Mitchells in a way that prevented the situation from spiraling completely out of control. He had seen enough to understand that pushing too hard could cost them everything, yet pulling back was not an option either. The balance he maintained was precise, almost surgical, forcing Russell into a position where his choices became increasingly limited. Russell, for the first time since the confrontation began, appeared to hesitate. It was not a dramatic shift, nor one that could be easily noticed by anyone not watching closely, but it was there, a fracture in the confidence he had carried up to that point. The realization that the Mitchells would not break, that they would continue pressing forward regardless of the risk, began to erode the control he believed he still held. Nearby, Grant Mitchell watched that hesitation with growing intensity, his instincts urging him to act, to force the situation to its conclusion before it could slip away again. Every second that passed felt like an opportunity lost, and yet he held back, guided not by patience, but by the understanding that one reckless move could undo everything they had fought to reach. At the same time, Sam Mitchell remained the unpredictable element within the confrontation, her connection to Russell continuing to influence the atmosphere in subtle but undeniable ways. The past between them had not been fully revealed, but its impact was clear. It created hesitation where there might otherwise have been violence, and in doing so, it opened a narrow path toward resolution that would not have existed otherwise. Eventually, the standoff reached its breaking point. Russell's position, once firm, began to weaken under the combined pressure of the Mitchells' persistence and the shifting dynamics within his own calculations. The leverage he held, Mark, no longer guaranteed control, especially as the situation around him became less predictable. What had started as a display of dominance was now turning into a test of survival, and for the first time, Russell had to consider the possibility that he might not walk away from it unchanged. It was in that moment of recalibration that the situation moved forward. The exact details of how Mark was brought back from that place remained obscured, almost deliberately so, as though the truth of those final exchanges was something too volatile to be fully revealed. What mattered was not the mechanics, but the outcome. The Mitchells did not leave empty-handed. Whether Mark emerged conscious, injured, or barely holding on was something that would only become clear later, but the fact that he was no longer in Russell's control marked a shift that could not be undone. The power Russell had wielded over the situation was broken, even if the consequences of his actions would continue to ripple outward. From that moment on, the urgency that had driven the Mitchells began to transform into something else, not relief, not entirely, but a fragile sense of closure that carried its own weight. They had acted, they had confronted, and they had pulled Mark back from the edge, but the cost of what had happened would not disappear simply because the immediate danger had passed. Not long after, they made their way back toward Walford, the journey carrying a different kind of silence than the one that had preceded it. This was not the silence of uncertainty, but of aftermath, the quiet recognition that something significant had just occurred, something that would leave marks long after the immediate crisis faded. Meanwhile, back in the square, Nigel's funeral had already begun to draw people together in a completely different way. The church stood as a place of reflection, of shared grief, where the chaos unfolding elsewhere remained largely unseen. The contrast between the two worlds, one defined by violence and urgency, the other by mourning and remembrance, was stark, yet they were bound together by the same timeline, the same sequence of events that refused to separate neatly. Inside the church, Julie stood at the front, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to speak. The weight of loss pressed heavily on her, making it difficult to find the words that could do justice to the life she was trying to honor. For a moment, it seemed as though she might falter, that the emotions would overwhelm her before she could begin. But then something shifted. Perhaps it was the presence of those who had gathered, perhaps it was the memory of Nigel himself, or perhaps it was simply the realization that this was the moment that mattered. Whatever the cause, Julie found her voice, and when she began to speak, the hesitation that had held her back gave way to something more steady, more certain. As she spoke, the room settled into a quiet that felt almost sacred, each word carrying meaning not just for her, but for everyone who had come to say goodbye. The return of Claire and Josh added to that sense of closure, their presence a reminder that even in loss, connections remained, drawing people back together in ways that could not be easily broken. By the time the Mitchells returned, the funeral had reached its most emotional point. Whether or not Mark was with them, whether he was strong enough to stand among them or forced to remain unseen, was something that remained deliberately uncertain, held back as if to preserve the tension that had defined the entire sequence of events. What was clear, however, was the shift that had taken place. The Mitchell family had faced a threat that could have torn them apart, and while they had managed to hold together, the experience had left its mark. The bonds between them were still intact, but they had been tested, stretched, and forced into shapes that would not easily return to what they had been before. As the final moments of the episode unfolded, the people of Walford gathered to give Nigel the farewell he deserved, their shared grief creating a sense of unity that stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. The church became a space where loss could be acknowledged, where memories could be honored, and where, for a brief moment, everything else could be set aside. And yet, beneath that surface of closure, the echoes of what had happened with Mark remained, unresolved and lingering, a reminder that in Walford, no story truly ends when it appears to. Because even as one chapter closes, another is already beginning. And for the Mitchells, the consequences of this day were only just starting to unfold.